Good afternoon, AP European History students. It is fantastic to be broadcasting to each and every one of you today. I am starting to get comfortable at staring at my computer screen and talking to it, although I think my neighbors are getting more and more uncomfortable, as typically I've been making these videos outside. But whatever. I'm coming to you from my kitchen right now. I would show you a little bit more, but well, we haven't done as much cleaning as we probably should. But you can see we're figuring out how to do this whole thing, figuring out how to parent while doing quarantine. And so my wife is sitting with our daughter playing outside, and I'm here making videos for you guys. So today we're going to look at the first supplemental assignment. And in addition, we're also going to kind of talk about the major idea of what this chapter really covers, and that is absolutism. So to begin with, I'm just going to go here to my slides, and we're going to start looking at this image. This is the image actually from the cover of Thomas Hobbes' treatise called Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes is going to be one of our Enlightenment philosophers. He's going to come up with the idea of the social contract, but it's Thomas Hobbes who is one of those individuals who provides the philosophical backdrop and underpinning and defense of this idea and political practice that occurs in the 17th century, and that is the idea of absolutist rule. So here you see a visual representation of absolutism, and you see it obviously because you clearly see a man with a crown on his head who is lording all over the land. And especially as we look at kind of what the whole cover is, well, what constitutes that person's power? Well, number one is going to be the military might or the political power that they hold, the ability to raise a standing army on their own, the ability to then use that army to put down any sort of rebellion, either of nobility and or of peasant, but the ability to provide protection and peace and prosperity for the land. On their left hand, you then see the religious symbol. This is going to be a religious scepter that signifies that not only does the king have political power, but they also, or temporal power, but they also have spiritual power as well. And you can see those two sides here represented on those two ideas represented on either side here. On our left, what the king's right would be is the signs of temporal power, both fortifications and defense, obviously cannons and the use of gunpowder technology that's going to become popularized in military during this time, but then also control over the church. And particularly control over who is going to be the head of that church, control over how that religion is going to go about, the idea of instituting kind of mini inquisitions. That's going to all be part of this absolutist ruler's reign. And then as we look even closer here, not only is the ruler going to be ruling over urban areas in places like Paris, for example, in France, or in England, London, but also all of the land, including all of the rural areas, all of the nobles' territory and manors throughout the entire kingdom. And all of those resources and things are to be under the one king or Leviathan's control. And this is going to become a popular form of government in both Central and Western Europe. Now, there will be some exceptions, and we're going to look at England and the English Civil War in a subsequent assignment, and then also the Dutch Golden Age from the Dutch Republic after we looked at last unit how the Dutch earned their independence from Spain. But absolutist monarchies are going to pop up all across Europe, and that's what the foundation of your individual student presentations are this week. And so this week you are going to be looking at how is it that these leviathans are taking control over their populations? And you're going to be comparing the leviathan or absolute monarch from your territory to probably the individual who is the epitome of absolutist rule, who, frankly, Hobbes actually looked across the English Channel as the example of a Leviathan, and that's going to be Louis the XIV. Now, Louis the XIV did not just create his absolutist rule out of nowhere, and in fact, the roots of absolutism goes back to the previous century as we look at those wars of religion. When we looked at last looked at France, we saw the foundations of the Bourbon monarchy developing, and that comes out of the War of the Three Henries, that war that developed because of the Protestant Reformation. Now, to take just a brief step backwards, again, last unit was all about the idea of Europe pulling itself out of the darkness, Europe coming out of the Middle Ages and setting the foundations for what would be then the rise of Europe's modernity. This, ladies and gentlemen, this time period of 1648 to 1814, this is when Europe really starts to push forward and centralize. Europe starts to solidify itself, and Europe begins to catch up to the rest of the world until eventually we then get to our next time period, which will be the 19th century, where Europe enters into the modern era. And so part of pulling Europe out of the darkness was the Protestant Reformation. And one of the major effects of the Protestant Reformation, other than just culturally fragmenting the Catholic Church, was also weakening the Catholic Church's hold and control and influence over politics. Remember, at the beginning of this chapter, you studied the 30 Years' War. At the Peace of Westphalia, the Pope isn't even invited. This is the first time you don't see the Pope actively engaged and invested in European political events, and especially a huge event like the 30 Years' War that brought in European kingdoms from all over the continent. And so we see this is the time period now where the church is losing its authority outside of Rome, both politically and in some ways even culturally. And with the War of the Three Henries, we see a couple of things happening. Well, number one, we see the development of the Bourbon monarchy, but we also see France agreeing to this idea of pluralism. Henry of Navarre, who becomes Henry IV, a Protestant, a Calvinist, a Huguenot, who is going to then convert to Catholicism, is going to institute the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes is going to allow for essentially pluralism within France. You can freedom of worship. If you want to be a Protestant, if you want to be a Catholic, that's okay. Now, those are the only two things that are okay, but you still have multiple different versions of Christianity there. And so when we look at the foundations for the Sun King, the War of the Three Henries really does solidify, though, the king's ability to declare what religion is legal in their territory. That gives the King of France religious power that the Pope did not have. By saying you can be a Catholic or a Protestant, it's the king, not the Pope, instituting what the religious makeup of the state will be. And so that's part of the War of the Three Henries. Now, in addition, you also had a couple of things happen. Henry III, who was the Valois monarch before Henry IV, he's killed by a mad monk. We talked about that, how he's assassinated. Well, Henry IV is also assassinated by a crazy Catholic. That's what it kind of said. Henry IV was sitting in traffic in his carriage, and this crazy Catholic fanatic jumped on his carriage and then stabbed the king to death. So you see twice now a religious conflict kind of still ensuing. And there, I believe, is the etching of the culprit for killing the king, the regicide, being drawn and quartered, which is really shows up nicely on my screen. You can really see how this is a frightening thing. You got the horses going all which ways, and then this guy's job is to literally just start hacking at things. So, whew, what a way to go. But don't kill the king, I guess, is the lesson to be learned there. But then you see then Louis XIII, who's going to be king. But before Louis XIII can be king, who's Henry IV's son, Louis is going to be too young to reign, and so his mother, Catherine de' Medici, is going to be a regent, and what she brings in is Cardinal Richelieu. Now, Cardinal Richelieu is a fascinating figure in European history. Cardinal Richelieu is one of those kind of Machiavellian individuals, and it's really interesting because when you look at Machiavelli, you think of somebody who is separate from the church, not somebody who is actively engaged in the more spiritual things in life. And Richelieu is a Machiavellian cardinal. I mean, he is a high member of the Gallic Church, or the French Catholic Church, who's going to be essentially ruling Paris in Louis's stead until Louis comes of age. And so he is going to help set the foundations for an absolutist monarch. He is going to set the foundations for the centralization of authority under this new Bourbon dynasty. Remember, the Valois monarchy in our last time period was very weak, largely because of their lack of funds and their lack of control. And the nobility around France had a lot of influence over what the monarchy would be able to do. Richelieu, and Mazarin, who's going to take over after Richelieu, is going to be the individual responsible for starting to pick away at that control of the nobility and centralizing it under the monarchy's control. And so one of the first things that he does is Richelieu orders the fact that nobles' fortifications to be torn down. If France is living in peacetime, why do all of these nobles need their walled castles and their walled cities? Those fortresses should be torn down. There should be regular flow of traffic in and out. There shouldn't be a place for these nobles to hide, essentially. And so he's going to order that to be down and in fact, enforce that to be torn down as well. He's going to increase the French bureaucracy, the crown's bureaucracy. He's going to create individuals known as intendants, or intendants, or intendants, who are going to be bureaucrats that are loyal to the king. Instead of using members of the nobility necessarily, they are going to hire out new bureaucrats that are going to be more known for their own abilities, for their own academic abilities, or their own economic abilities, their own governing abilities, individuals that are going to be chosen by the crown. Now, these individuals are, of course, going to be granted titles of nobility as well if they're not nobles already. And that's going to lead to something known as nobles of the robe instead of nobles of the sword. And we're going to get to that in just a second. But in general, I want you to know that the intendants are an example of Richelieu growing the bureaucracy of the French crown and ensuring that that bureaucracy is loyal directly to the king, or in this case, Richelieu and his regency. Again, one of the major issues for the French crown was the fact that they did not have the funds to compete with the nobles. And so Richelieu realized that he needed to expand the treasury. One way to do that? Double the taille, double that hearth tax, double taxes, increase the treasury, grow the monarchy's wealth so that it is able to raise its own private army that is loyal to the king, no longer relying on their nobility. And so you see the raising of the taille to twice its original. But probably what Richelieu is most famous for is his intricate network of spies. And these are spies that are going to be looking at what each of the nobles are doing. What are they saying? Are they plotting against the crown? What is happening that Mazarin or that Richelieu cannot see? And he's going to have those spies report back to him. And if anybody is plotting any sort of is plotting anything against the crown, he will have those people eliminated in brutal fashion. And so again, that's a way for the centralization of authority to go away from power in the nobility's hands and then directly into the hands of the monarch. Now, Louis XIII is going to die of natural causes. I believe he dies of, I forget what he dies of, but he dies of natural causes, and that's going to leave poor Louis XIV to be the one who reigns in his stead. Now, Louis XIV is going to also be too young, and so yet again another cardinal is going to be named as regent for the king, and the person who is directly organizing the government. Now, Mazarin's going to continue doing a lot of the things that Richelieu did and continue to centralize the authority, but Mazarin's going to find himself with a major issue, and that is a huge revolt of the nobility against all of those policies that Richelieu had set up and that Mazarin had gone. Now, particularly the nobility that are known as the nobility of the sword. Now, this idea of nobles of the robes versus nobles of the sword, what does that even mean? Well, nobles of the sword are the traditional landed aristocracy that had power in France since probably Charlemagne's reign. Those individuals who had held both military and political control over their individual manors and territories under the feudal system. What makes them nobles of the sword? Well, what made the nobility so important to medieval France is their ability to defend against the Vikings, so their military power in order to fight against any sort of outside attack. And therefore, only the nobility were able to raise their own armies, carry swords in some cases, and so the nobility, saying they're nobles of the sword, that's going back to their old military role within feudal society, something that had largely underpinned their power and their influence in French politics throughout. The nobles of the robe were those bureaucrats that the crown was granting titles of nobility to for their service to the crown. This was, again, a way of lessening the power of those traditional nobles. They're granting titles of nobility to people who weren't born nobles. That means that some people are having this ability for social mobility, joining the ranks of the nobility because of things that they are able to do, but those things are useful to the crown. And so because of this new nobility that is joining their ranks, the nobles of the sword banded together and had this huge rebellion. And that rebellion is known as the Fronde. And the Fronde racked France. It put France into incredible chaos. And in fact, at one point, Louis XIV finds his bedroom stormed into as a little kid as these nobles are rioting in the streets and creating absolute havoc. And so when we start looking at Louis XIV, one of the first things that he is going to do is he's going to remove the royal palace from Paris because of what he remembered as a child. Now, eventually, Mazarin and Louis XIV and other nobles who want to protect the monarchy are able to suppress the Fronde, but that's going to be one of those defining moments in French history that really lays the foundations for Louis XIV, our marvelous, marvelous Sun King, this absolute epitome of absolutist authority. I mean, beautiful both in a physical way. I mean, the dude is gorgeous. He looks like a 1980s hair metal rocker meets ballerina, now which is actually accurate because he did love to dance ballet. I mean, check out those calves. You can totally see the guy was an athlete. He loved to be on the move, physically fit, definitely with it. Louis is going to be one of the most enigmatic, just he's the most interesting person in European history for what he is able to do in France. And he becomes famous for his strategies of gaining complete control over not just the nobility, but also pretty much all of France. He increases the power of the French monarchy to incredible amounts and makes France a dominant world power. Well, dominant might be going too far since he does lose a lot of money and to overseas wars that he gets destroyed at, but such is the nature of French warfare. But again, you can see here in both of these official portraits, Louis is portrayed as larger than life. In this one, which is his official kind of portrait as king, you can see him in his coronation robe. You can see the military power that he wields in this sword, the religious power that he wields here. I mean, all of the fleur-de-lis in his beautiful coronation robe are just intricately woven and designed with golden thread. I mean, you are supposed to see absolute opulence. So your first supplemental assignment is kind of twofold. Number one, it's to help you unpack and help your classmates unpack how it is that Louis gained total control over his territory. But then also, for your classmates who are doing their student presentations, this is going to serve as a way for them to get more evidence to compare their absolute monarchs to Louis. And so I'm going to switch gears here just to show you what I'm talking about. If you go to our distance learning document, you can see here that first supplemental assignment. You're watching the Octodal video, so that will have a link to it in just a bit. And then you're going to be doing this Google slide assignment using the pages by John Merriman. So if you clicked on this Google slide assignment, it would take you to this Google slide deck. So here's what you're to do with this. What you are to do is follow these directions. I'm going to assign you guys, I'm going to put it directly on this direction page. I'm going to assign you guys one of 4 sections to read. You are to read just that one section. From that one section, I want you to find one way or one piece of evidence that Louis took absolute control over his subjects during his reign. When you find that piece of evidence, I want you to then find an image that represents what Louis did. In the speaker notes, I'm then going to have you explain that piece of evidence. So, for example, in this first section, if you look at the document, each of the sections is going to have an italicized heading to start it. So this first section talks about mercantilism under Louis XIV. I actually started in the paragraphs before it just for my example. But when I read this document, I noticed that this first section, one of the things that Louis does almost immediately after taking the crown, fairly at a young age. That's right, he was only 13, as you can see there. One of the first things he does is he makes it clear that the Parlement of Paris could not meddle in the king's business. Now, the parlements are going to be local law courts, but these local law courts had influential say in regional politics because they were the ones judging the laws that the king or the governor would be making. And so he said the Parlement of Paris could not meddle in the king's business. And then he then goes, in 1673, he deprives all 12 of the parlements their right to issue remonstrances. Whoa, what a word. Which is a formal objection to the king's new ordinances, edicts, or declarations. So he takes their ability to essentially complain about what the king is doing, which therefore takes the voices of the people. When we say the people, of course, we mean the nobility, but he's taking the voices of the nobility away, saying, no, power rests in me alone. And so I went to the slide deck. I put a picture of the parlements, and Louis, I think, addressing the parlements. I labeled my name so that I know who does these things. And then I gave my explanation here in the speaker's note. Again, it's just a couple of sentences. This assignment probably won't take you very long. You've already taken notes on Louis XIV as well. This reading is just going to give you a different interpretation and a different lens to look at what you already read in Spielvogel. But I want you to do this, and the hope is that these slides are going to be filled with images, with evidence and explanation that will help to give you and your classmates an idea of how Louis effectively gained and maintained control in France. And in a sense, gives this idea of the playbook of absolutist monarchs. Because again, other monarchs are going to be looking at Louis as the example, the epitome of absolutist authority. And so you can just see here the different sections. Mercantilism under Louis. This is going to be gaining control over the economy. Now, we've talked a little bit about mercantilism and the idea that the philosophy and economic philosophy of mercantilism. This is going to be a huge way that crowns are going to be gaining control over the economy. So in what ways do they do that? Then you're going to be looking at absolutist rule. How do they reshape the French political systems? We've already talked about one of those as we see the expansion of the bureaucracy. And who is working in those bureaucratic positions is going to be another major shift. Part 3, and probably my absolute favorite. I mean, gosh, this is priceless. The Palace of Versailles was used as a political tool to control the nobility. And the things that Louis does is just absolutely brilliant. I mean, I wish that I could have just a semblance of this sort of social influence over anybody, because I don't have any social influence, especially not even close to the degree that Louis is able to. I mean, when people are literally competing for Who gets to throw out the king's chamber pot, the thing that he is relieving himself in? I mean, that is social control if I've ever heard it. You're going to be reading about how he is going to control and kind of restructure the way the nobility is set up. And then lastly, you're going to be looking at the persecution of religious minorities. How does Louis create enemies of the state? How does Louis take cultural control over his territory? How does he take cultural control over France? I mean, one of the first things that you're going to be seeing that he does is he revokes the Edict of Nantes and makes the Catholic or Gallic Church the official church of France, and Louis is going to be the one who is going to be running the church, essentially. So you're looking at these four ways that how Louis is going to be taking absolute control. That provides the blueprint for other monarchs. So as you're looking at this, and you're looking then back at your reading, your notes, your pieces reflection, or if you're one of the groups that's doing the presentations, you're using this as kind of a blueprint to look at the other absolutist monarchs and really comparing them to Louis and saying, if Louis is the epitome of absolutist rule, to what extent were these other monarchs absolutist in their practices? The last thing I really just want to look at, because I just think it's absolutely hysterical, if we look at these pictures of Louis the XIV, and it has to be a little bit reminiscent of your childhood, and I'm not going to at all assume anymore that your childhood was anything like mine, but if it was filled with those kind of classic 90s Disney films. And one of those classic Disney films, well, not necessarily from the 90s, might have been earlier in the 90s, but those classic Disney films is Peter Pan. And if you look especially at this picture of Louis XIV, you should see that Louis XIV looks a lot like Captain Hook. And that's because when you start looking at the exceptions to absolutism, England and the Netherlands, that's going to be one of the first instances of, well, other than the 100 Years' War, but the first instances of English nationalism. The English are English because they are not French. And so when you see this development of an evil character like Captain Hook, it is very much so modeled after Louis XIV, the way he dresses, the way he acts, the way he carries himself. That is all supposed to be reminiscent of Louis XIV, because what the English considered is that's the opposite of what it means to be an English monarch. An English monarch is not absolutist. The English monarch shares power with the people, and by the people, of course, we always mean the nobility. And so I just thought that was a really fun thing. I want you to enjoy this chapter. I think it's absolutely fascinating how these individuals are gaining so much control over their territories. I think it's really fun to be reading about people like Louis XIV and Peter the Great. Oh my gosh, Peter the Great. Enjoy this time. I think it's a really fun chapter. I think it's a chapter you should be able to just sink your teeth into. I encourage you to watch those John Green videos. Those are going to also be very helpful for you. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead, feel free to email me. I will be sending out more information on our Zoom meeting on Wednesday and how that's going to go, and when your small group is going to be talking to me and meeting with me. I really look forward to seeing all of you guys. I hope you are safe. I hope your families are safe. I hope you're all staying sane. I hope you're getting some exercise. I hope you're eating well. And please let me know if there's any way I can support you. Until next time, see you later.